built?
We have built, I think, getting on for 200,000 over the last year. Of course, there needs to be a real ramping up of that, which is why we need...
You'll get nowhere near 1.5 million, will you, if you're building them at that rate?
Well, what we've also done, of course, is to change the planning regulations in order to make it easier to start building houses more quickly. And we will make sure that we've got the skilled labour there to be able to do that. And in doing that, we'll also be providing opportunities for young people. And of course, it is shocking that there are nearly 1 million young people who are neither earning or learning in the economy at the moment. That's why, as we made clear over the weekend, we will provide a new youth guarantee. We'll provide support for young people to get the training and the support to get into work. But if a young person has been unemployed for 18 months, they'll then be offered a 6-month work placement, fully funded for the employer, with support around that to help them to get into work. But they will be expected to...
Right. Imagine being sent onto live television to defend your government's handling of one of the most serious child safeguarding issues in British history, only to be absolutely demolished by a journalist who refuses to accept your excuses. That is exactly what just happened to Labour Minister Baroness Jacqui Smith on GB News. She was grilled mercilessly by host Ellie Costello about why the National Grooming Gangs inquiry has been delayed for 6 months with absolutely no progress. No chair appointed, no terms of reference established, nothing. And when Smith tried every deflection tactic in the book, when she tried blaming the Tories, when she claimed Labour is working hard, Costello systematically destroyed every single excuse. Stay with British royal family, because this humiliation exposes Labour's deliberate obstruction on an issue affecting thousands of vulnerable children. Quick favour, if you are already furious about Labour dragging their feet on this crucial inquiry, smash that subscribe button right now. Over 92% of you have not yet. It is completely free, takes 1 second, and genuinely means everything to us. Cheers if you did. Right, let us talk about why this interview was absolutely devastating. A Labour minister was grilled on GB News after she denied the government was delaying the National Grooming Gangs inquiry. Denied, not explained, not justified. Flat out denied despite overwhelming evidence that Labour has made zero progress in 6 months. The interview followed widespread criticism over Labour's complete failure to establish the inquiry they promised. Meanwhile, the Conservative Party has set out new proposals for a judge-led inquiry to replace the delayed investigation, because even the opposition has lost faith in Labour's ability to deliver. Skills Minister Baroness Jacqui Smith was questioned by host Ellie Costello, and Costello came prepared with facts, timelines and brutal directness. She asked, 6 months on from the government formally announcing this national inquiry into grooming gangs, we still do not have a chair and we still do not have the terms of reference laid out. Why is this government dragging its feet on this? 6 months, half a year since Labour made their big announcement, half a year of promises and commitments. And what do we have to show for it? Absolutely nothing. No chair, no terms of reference, no progress whatsoever. That is not bureaucratic delay. That is deliberate obstruction. That is a government that announced an inquiry to satisfy public outrage but has no intention of actually conducting it in any meaningful time frame. Baroness Smith tried the standard political deflection. It is not. We are working hard on making sure that that inquiry is set up and works along the sorts of bases that you have talked about, identifying the nature of people who were responsible for this absolute abomination, including religious and ethnic backgrounds. The government has been very, very clear about that. Working hard. That is what politicians always say when they have accomplished absolutely nothing. We are working hard. We are committed. We are making progress. All meaningless phrases designed to create the illusion of activity without demonstrating any actual results. And notice the language, very, very clear, about what exactly, about their intentions, because their actions tell a completely different story. Then Smith deployed the inevitable deflection. The last Tory government had a considerable amount of time to put in place the recommendations of the Child Safeguarding Review. They failed to do that. There it is. Blame the previous government. The Tories failed, therefore Labour's failures are somehow excusable. That is not accountability. That is responsibility dodging. That is a minister who cannot defend her own government's record, desperately trying to change the subject. But Ellie Costello was not having any of it. She came back with an absolutely brutal follow-up. But what is taking so long? You have had 6 months. There is still no chair. There is still no terms of reference. There are people saying it felt as though you were being dragged to the table, kicking and screaming to even get a national inquiry in the first place. And now there is a theory that you are deploying blocking tactics to try and push this past the next general election. That is journalism. That is holding power to account, dragged to the table kicking and screaming, deploying blocking tactics, pushing this past the election. Costello is not just asking questions, she is directly accusing Labour of deliberately sabotaging their own inquiry to avoid political consequences before voters go to the polls. That is serious. That is alleging governmental corruption and obstruction on one of the most sensitive issues in British politics. Baroness Smith swiftly replied, "No, that is completely wrong. And what is more, we have taken action on a range of other recommendations from the child safeguarding inquiry that the Tories chose to sit on for years when they were actually in government. It is no point now being outraged in opposition for Kemi Badenoch. She could have acted when she was in government. She did not. Completely wrong. That is the entire defence. Not here is our timeline. Not here is why it legitimately takes 6 months. Not here are the specific concrete steps we have taken. Just completely wrong. Deny and deflect." And then another desperate attempt to blame the Tories. More finger-pointing at Kemi Badenoch. More attempts to change the subject from Labour's failures to Conservative failures. But that does not answer the question. That does not explain why 6 months have passed with zero tangible progress. The interview was a masterclass in how journalism should work. Costello refused to accept vague reassurances. She refused to let Smith derail the conversation by blaming the previous government. She kept pressing on the specific, concrete question, why has Labour made absolutely no progress in 6 months? And Smith had no answer. She could only deflect, blame others, and repeat meaningless phrases about working hard. This matters profoundly because the grooming gangs inquiry is not some abstract policy debate. This is about thousands of children who were systematically abused, raped, and trafficked over decades whilst authorities turned a blind eye. This is about one of the greatest institutional failures in modern British history. This is about ensuring accountability, justice, and preventing future abuse. And Labour announced an inquiry 6 months ago to great fanfare and has done absolutely nothing since except make excuses on television. The theory that Costello raised, that Labour is deploying blocking tactics to push this past the election, becomes more credible with every passing day, because an inquiry that actually produces findings before the next election could be politically catastrophic for Labour. It could expose failures by Labour-run councils who ignored warnings for years. It could reveal uncomfortable truths about the perpetrators that Labour does not want to discuss. It could create a firestorm of controversy that damages Labour's electoral prospects. So the strategy becomes obvious. Announce the inquiry, make a theatrical show of commitment, and then delay absolutely everything until after the election when political pressure has dissipated. This is cynical politics at its absolute worst, using vulnerable children as political props, announcing inquiries to satisfy public outrage with no intention of delivering results, deploying blocking tactics to avoid accountability. That is what Costello was accusing Labour of doing, and Smith's inability to provide any substantive defence makes that accusation extremely credible. The grooming gangs inquiry should be straightforward. Appoint a qualified chair, establish clear terms of reference, begin investigations, interview witnesses, examine evidence, produce findings, recommend reforms, hold people accountable. That is basic governmental function. The fact that Labour cannot even accomplish the first 2 steps after 6 months reveals either spectacular incompetence or deliberate obstruction. Given the political sensitivities involved, obstruction seems far more likely. Baroness Smith went on GB News expecting to deliver standard talking points and move on. Instead, she got systematically demolished by a journalist who actually did her job, who came prepared with facts, who refused to accept deflection, who pressed for actual answers rather than political spin, and Smith was left floundering, unable to defend the indefensible, reduced to blaming the Tories and claiming Labour is working hard whilst providing zero evidence of actual work. This humiliation matters because it exposes how Labour operates. They make big announcements, they promise action, they claim to care deeply about issues, and then they do absolutely nothing whilst hoping nobody notices. They rely on friendly media interviews where they are not challenged. They rely on journalists accepting their spin without scrutiny. But when they face someone like Ellie Costello, who actually presses them on specifics, who demands concrete answers, who refuses to let them change the subject, the entire facade collapses immediately. Voters are watching this. Voters see a government that announced a grooming gangs inquiry 6 months ago and has made zero progress. Voters see a minister going on television and getting humiliated because she cannot answer basic questions about timelines and deliverables. Voters see deflection, blame shifting, and excuses rather than accountability and results. And voters are drawing their own conclusions about whether Labour can be trusted to deliver on anything they promise. The Conservative Party proposing their own judge-led inquiry to replace Labour's failed effort adds another layer of humiliation. Even the opposition has given up on Labour delivering this inquiry. They are proposing alternatives because they understand Labour will keep delaying indefinitely. That is devastating. That is the opposition essentially saying Labour is so incompetent or so corrupt that we need to bypass them entirely. 6 months. No chair, no terms of reference, no progress. Just excuses, deflections and a humiliated minister on GB News unable to defend her government's record. That is the state of Labour's grooming gangs inquiry. That is what happens when a government makes promises it has no intention of keeping. Thanks so much for watching. See you in the next one.